My colleague Vuyo Mvoko is standing by now with political analyst Professor Susan Booysen to speak a little bit more about the 55th ANC National Conference. Vuyo, it's over to you.
Thanks, SABC. Indeed, Prof is here with me to just go through some of the stuff that perhaps is going to happen tomorrow, Prof. But perhaps before we do that, we were chatting earlier about how different, at least the past few hours we've had of this conference, how different it is from anything we've seen before.
Yes, it's fascinating how these conferences of the ANC have certain continuities but also so different. And this year is potentially a re-election conference of the ANC. And we can think back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in 2002, Thabo Mbeki, Stellenbosch, re-elected, or elected now. And then has gone to 2012, Mangaung, Jacob Zuma, re-election conference, a lot of agitation, and yet he won with a big majority, which also, of course, that was the time when Cyril Ramaphosa was brought in after Kgalema Motlanthe lost against him. And this year, now suddenly we're in a potential re-election conference where Cyril Ramaphosa is facing real challenges. And it's interesting, he's facing challenges not in terms of the initial numbers of delegates. We know that they had a good majority out of the 2,000 and something votes, but there are 4,500 roughly delegates, and we do not know how the rest are going to cast their ballots. Also no indication yet, no revelation, no transparency what came from the branches. So there's a potential upset this time around. Potential. He seems to have a good, solid lead, and we haven't heard concrete evidence from the ground yet on advances made by Zweli Mkhize. And if there's some rebellion from the conference floor and new candidates being nominated, then of course there can be splits in the votes, and that's something that the Ramaphosa camp is also very concerned about, because should anything happen to Cyril Ramaphosa, and should he in the months and years ahead be forced to step aside, then there isn't somebody from within the Ramaphosa camp, the known camp at this stage, to succeed as deputy president. So yes, deputy president, we seem to think, it seems clear that Paul Mashatile has got a good lead, but there are still efforts to prevent that as well. So yes, these re-election conferences have really varied in character over the years, very much so, from Thabo Mbeki's to Jacob Zuma's to Cyril Ramaphosa's. And interesting this time around also, Cyril Ramaphosa is really spooked by Jacob Zuma ruling from the political grave, and that is also quite new, although we also see Thabo Mbeki coming back, and so these former presidents really also campaigning jointly against Cyril Ramaphosa, and these are important differences this time around.
But what about the person who is the ANC delegate these days? How do they differ from what you had in previous conferences? Because my view is that that will also have a lot of bearing on what we're going to see once they start voting for whoever.
That's a fascinating dimension of these elections. We know in the earlier days of the ANC, Thabo Mbeki was more or less destined to take over from Nelson Mandela, and it was relatively uncontested. Sometimes one thinks the 2002 Stellenbosch conference ANC was the quietest one ever. There's almost not a sign of contest. But then after that, when Thabo Mbeki started showing signs that he really wants to cling to this position, then things started heating up. And over the years, the branches have been elevated in their status as the core decision makers, really where the final autonomy of the ANC lies. And it's a bit ironic too.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Prof, because you know, this conference is supposedly a delegates conference.
Exactly.
But there is something that has been introduced where you hear ANC leaders say, actually, each province has a mandate. In other words, once a province discusses, then everyone who is from that province carries the mandate of the province. In other words, even if you may have preferred another candidate, the fact that the majority in your provinces, I mean in your province, have selected candidate A, that's what you should come here and do, vote for that candidate.
There are so many contradictions and ironies and truths in that equation, that the branches are the ultimate one. I'm emphasizing that they were elevated and given this aura, but they're really not. We saw how Stan Matabato early January this year, January 8th statement, said that Cyril Ramaphosa would be the province of Limpopo's choice. What about the branches? And the branches gradually came in and then probably were quite influenced by their political superiors in that province and what those people want. There are political ambitions and opportunities at stake in that. And even so, here at the conference like this one, we see the branches coming with their mandates confirmed in a way by the provincial general councils in the last week. Not quite sure whether they could override the branches. And then come ultimately, we know so little and so much. We've heard so much about the horse trading and the bartering between different potential slates and cross-provincial slates. If you give us 2 positions in Gauteng, we'll support you in KwaZulu-Natal, etc. And that is totally distant from the branches and the branch mandates.
Exactly.
And if there are little or big brown envelopes being passed around,
add that dimension
what about that original mandate from the branches? So it's quite a bit of a fallacy as well.
Yeah, well, we've had, very little by way of evidence, because I would imagine that by now people would have come forward if envelopes, were being passed around.
Yeah, by the enemies.
Yes, but I do remember, in one interview we did with Dr. Zweli Mkhize and Phumulo Maswale, who were saying that, look, we know, we've been told that people are going to be given money, in exchange for their votes, but we're saying to our people, take the money but do the right thing.
We hear there were some entrepreneurs there who collected money from both sides for disbursement to whoever was the one who got the Christmas bonus.
Well, we're going to see if indeed that's something that's going to happen. What does your gut feel tell you? Any likelihood that there can be candidates or a candidate that can come from the floor and rock things, or rock the boat, so to speak?
I haven't got information about any specific name that pushes a certain person to the surface as the next potential president. But then we know from Nasrec 1 5 years ago, the trade-offs that happened there and how the Premier League maneuvered and in actions that pushed not just Paul Mashatile right to the top of the political hierarchies, but also brought in Didi Mabuza instead of Lindiwe Sisulu, or maybe even it affected NDZ's chances as well. So, but that we know that those kind of tricks are played at ANC conferences. So one has to keep open that possibility that there can be a new alignment, that there can be agreement, a new person that can be nominated from the floor then. If we support these provinces, support these persons, this particular person, then you get some other benefits. And we know the exact delegate numbers per conference, per province, I should say. And so we know how they have to play their games. And seemingly, the provincial leaders have a lot of gravitas in uniting the votes that come for their provinces. So much again for the branches.
Quick last one, Prof. The fact that there are no sort of distinct slates,
Yes.
And coming as this conference comes at the back of the last one, same venue, where you did have 2 slates, but people voted differently, and then they ended up you know, we ended up with a completely different outcome from what people expected, that if you're on this slate and the slate is numbers, then everyone wins. That didn't happen last time.
Yes.
And this time around, there are no distinct slates.
You know, there are slates and there are not slates, because the not slates are undergirded by the actually essential slates. And then you get the cross slates, and the cross slates are the ones that are pulling together different provinces. So it's as if the different provinces this time around come with their provincial slates and their provincial candidates. We know how aggrieved KwaZulu-Natal felt the last time around that they didn't get anybody in the top 6, and that has passed on around the provinces. So it's really the trade-offs we see now are between provincial slates undergirded by the 2 big slates. Everybody in those provinces know who on their provincial executives comes from which side, which nomination from a particular province comes from which side of the 2 big slates, but now they barter between the provinces to try to ascend.
Prof, let's leave it there for tonight. Professor Susan Booysen, who's been keeping me company here over the past couple of hours. Well, I mean, the voting was supposed to start happening tomorrow morning, but I'm sure as everyone would know by now, the conference started very late, about 8 hours late, which then means a lot of things that were supposed to happen tonight, today, this afternoon and this evening didn't happen. So they're going to start with your credentials, with your organizational report, financial report, before they get to the actual nominations and voting. And as is often the case, credentials is also another item on the agenda to look out for tomorrow, because this is where people who would have come to conference unhappy about one thing or the other are going to fight, and the various factions and groupings are going to slug it out, and that often delays the program. We'll see whether indeed that's going to be the case at this conference as well. But from us here at Nasrec, we're about to stand down, and it's back to Tsepiso after this short break. Good night.